In the golden age of post-war American naval dominance, the USS Forrestal, CV-59, stood as a symbol of unmatched power and ambition. Commissioned in 1955, she was the first of the so-called supercarriers, massive, nuclear-capable behemoths built to project force in an age where the Cold War was turning hot in proxy battles around the world. Named after James Forrestal, the first U.S. Secretary of Defense, the ship embodied the changing face of naval warfare. With an angled flight deck, steam catapults, and innovations borrowed from British designs, Forrestal was built not for yesterday's dogfights, but for the jet age. Displacing over 80,000 tons fully loaded and measuring more than 3 football fields in length, the Forrestal carried an air wing of nearly 100 aircraft and a complement of around 5,000 sailors, aviators, and Marines. She was a floating city, a mobile airport, and a weapons platform all in one. By the summer of 1967, Forrestal was no stranger to the pressure of global tension. She had already patrolled the Mediterranean and served as a deterrent in the volatile Atlantic. But this deployment was different. Now operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, the Forrestal was on her first combat tour, launching sorties against North Vietnamese targets as part of Task Force 77. Her decks were bustling with activity. A-4 Skyhawks, F-4 Phantoms, and RA-5 Vigilantes sat wingtip to wingtip, loaded with fuel and ordnance, waiting for the next mission. The crew moved with both precision and fatigue, having settled into a deadly rhythm of daily combat operations. For all its size and strength, the Forrestal was still just one ship, vulnerable to the smallest error or unforeseen event. As the sun rose on July 29, 1967, no one aboard could imagine the chain reaction that was about to begin. A catastrophe was coming, and it would test the limits of training, endurance, and courage on a ship where every man would have to choose between survival and sacrifice. It was just another morning aboard the Forrestal. The sea was calm, the air already thick with heat and jet fuel. On the flight deck, final preparations were underway for the next series of strike missions against North Vietnamese targets. Crews armed aircraft, checked fuel lines, and ran through pre-flight checklists. Each man had a job, and each job had to be done with speed and precision. This was the machinery of war, humming with deadly efficiency. Among the aircraft on the deck that morning was an F-4 Phantom II, parked near the starboard side of the ship, carrying a pair of unguided Zuni rockets mounted beneath its wing. These rockets were known to be temperamental, sensitive to surges in voltage, and prone to unintentional discharge if handled carelessly, or if electronic interference occurred. At precisely 10:50 a.m., a Zuni rocket unexpectedly launched from the parked A-4. Without warning, it shot across the deck and struck an A-4 Skyhawk parked across the way. The Skyhawk, designated side number 416, belonged to Lieutenant Commander John S. McCain III. The rocket ruptured the aircraft's external fuel tank, causing jet fuel to spew across the deck and ignite instantly. The explosion was violent and sudden. Flames erupted around McCain's aircraft, and within seconds, multiple fires began spreading among the tightly packed jets. McCain, realizing his aircraft was engulfed, scrambled out of the cockpit and across the deck to safety, narrowly escaping the inferno. Chaos erupted. Fire suppression crews rushed towards the blaze, but they were already behind. A 1,000-pound bomb beneath the burning Skyhawk had begun to cook off. The old ordnance, a leftover from World War II, was less stable than modern munitions and had a shorter cook time under extreme heat. Just moments after the fire began, the first bomb detonated. The explosion killed many of the initial responders and blew a crater into the flight deck, sending debris and bodies flying. Shock waves rattled the ship, and shrapnel ignited secondary fires. The disaster had begun. Within minutes, it would escalate into one of the deadliest naval catastrophes in U.S. history. By the early 1960s, the 5-inch Zuni rocket was standard armament aboard U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aircraft. Designed for air-to-ground strikes, the Zuni could carry high explosive warheads and was prized for its speed and punch. But there was a dark side, one that was rarely discussed outside of ordnance shops and hangar decks. The Zuni's electrical ignition system made it vulnerable to unintentional discharge. In theory, the rocket was supposed to remain inert until a pilot flipped the arming switch mid-flight. In practice, electrical surges, especially during power transfers between external carts and internal aircraft systems, could bypass safety interlocks. On flight decks full of live weapons, this was a disaster waiting to happen. There had been previous incidents. On multiple occasions, Zuni rockets had fired during startup or maintenance procedures. While those earlier misfires had been written off as anomalies or crew error, the pattern was undeniable. No redesign came. The Forrestal incident finally forced the Navy's hand. The Zuni rocket that launched on July 29 did so without pilot input, triggered by an unexpected surge. It flew across the deck, struck an A-4 Skyhawk, and began the chain reaction that killed 134 sailors. In the aftermath, the Navy initiated a comprehensive review of rocket safety systems. Interlocks were improved, handling protocols were rewritten, and certain variants of the Zuni were phased out. But for many, it was too little, too late. The Zuni rocket remains a case study in how a small, overlooked flaw can have catastrophic consequences when scaled to the high-stakes environment of naval aviation. It was fast, powerful, and dangerously easy to ignite. A spark, a flaw, a fire that changed everything. To understand what went wrong aboard the Forrestal that morning, one must examine the equipment, the procedures, and the fateful positioning of aircraft on the crowded deck. The Zuni rocket, a 5-inch folding fin aerial rocket, was originally developed in the 1950s. Reliable in combat, but finicky on deck, it had a history of accidental discharges due to electrical malfunctions. On July 29th, one such malfunction sparked a catastrophe. The F-4 Phantom that launched the rogue rocket was undergoing final checks. An electrical surge, likely caused by switching from external to internal power, triggered the Zuni to fire. There was no countdown, no warning, no operator error, just a flaw in the system. The rocket streaked across the flight deck, striking McCain's A-4 Skyhawk. But that strike alone didn't doom the Forrestal. What followed was a perfect storm of bad luck and outdated munitions. Beneath McCain's aircraft were 1,000-pound AN M65 bombs, vintage World War II iron ordnance that was never meant to be stored in such heat. In fact, multiple officers had previously raised concerns about these bombs. Their condition was questionable, and their sensitivity to heat was dangerously underestimated. When the fuel ignited around McCain's Skyhawk, the temperature rose fast. These older bombs didn't have the insulation or safety coatings of their modern counterparts. The first one detonated within 90 seconds of the fire starting, far faster than damage control crews had anticipated. The blast killed Chief Aviation Boatswain's mate Gerald Ferrier and his entire fire suppression team. These men were the first line of defense, and they were vaporized in an instant. The explosion tore a hole in the flight deck, ignited nearby aircraft, and hurled burning shrapnel in every direction. As more bombs cooked off, the situation spiraled out of control. The tightly packed aircraft, each laden with fuel and ordnance, became ticking time bombs. Efforts to push aircraft overboard were heroic, but often too late. The heat was so intense it melted aluminum and burned through steel. Sailors with little to no firefighting training were suddenly thrown into a nightmare. The Zuni rocket was the spark, but it was the perfect storm of flawed weapons, human vulnerability, and bad deck logistics that turned a freak accident into a mass casualty event. As the fire spread, more lives would be lost, and more questions would emerge, including the one that still lingers. Could this have been prevented? The first bomb's explosion was only the beginning. With each passing minute, more ordnance began to detonate in a vicious chain reaction. The air filled with the crack and boom of bombs going off and the screams of the wounded. Aircraft were incinerated where they stood. Fireballs leapt skyward and shrapnel rained down across the ship like metallic hail. In the heart of the chaos, sailors acted with raw instinct and unmatched bravery. Many ran toward the fire, dragging hoses, pulling injured shipmates to safety, or throwing bombs and missiles overboard by hand, in a desperate effort to limit the damage. There were no safe zones. Flames licked at fuel lines, munitions cooked in the heat. The fire spread rapidly through multiple aircraft and ignited secondary explosions across the flight deck. Hoses melted in the heat, aluminum turned to slag, paint blistered and burned off bulkheads. Helicopters arrived to medevac the injured as black smoke billowed hundreds of feet into the sky. Crew members who had never held a fire nozzle found themselves drafted into firefighting teams, some wearing only t-shirts and helmets, no protective gear. Still, the bombs kept cooking off. Sailors near the edge of the deck were hurled overboard by the shock waves or dove into the sea to escape the fire. Others suffocated below decks as smoke flooded the ventilation systems. Lifeboats and rescue helicopters worked in unison to pull survivors from the water. The ship's firefighting capability, already hampered by the loss of trained damage control personnel in the initial blasts, now depended on the resolve and improvisation of the survivors. Makeshift barriers were constructed, damaged hoses were patched, buckets, fire extinguishers, even bare hands were used. For 90 minutes, the flight deck was a war zone. The ship was not under attack, but it might as well have been. And the worst was still to come below the deck plates. One of the most chilling revelations following the Forrestal disaster was that many of the bombs loaded onto the flight deck that day were relics of another war. The 1,000-pound AN M65 bombs, standard fare in World War II, had been pulled from storage depots in the Pacific and rushed to Vietnam to meet demand. These bombs were over 2 decades old. Their composition had degraded. Their casings were thinner and more susceptible to heat. Unlike modern munitions with improved thermal resistance, the World War II era bombs had short cook-off times and detonated unpredictably when exposed to fire. Aviation ordnance officers aboard Forrestal had raised red flags before the incident. They noted that the bombs sweated liquid, had visible corrosion, and reacted poorly to humidity and temperature. But with munitions in short supply and strike missions ongoing, the warnings were ignored. The bombs were loaded anyway. When fire engulfed the Skyhawks on deck, these unstable weapons proved fatal. Some exploded after less than a minute of exposure. Others detonated in sympathetic bursts, setting off chain reactions that claimed dozens of lives. In the wake of the disaster, the Navy overhauled the ordnance handling procedures. Age limits were enforced, inspection standards were tightened, the use of outdated bombs was curtailed, and carrier magazines were re-inventoried to ensure compatibility with jet-era operations. The Forrestal fire was not just a story of equipment failure, it was a warning about complacency. And no detail was more emblematic of that than the presence of World War II bombs in the middle of the Vietnam War. Below the decks, the fire was beginning to consume the very bones of the Forrestal. Fires had breached the hangar deck, and toxic smoke poured into ventilation systems, passageways, and berthing compartments. As above, so below, panic, confusion, and chaos. Damage control teams, many of them hastily assembled from sailors with minimal training, fought to assess the full extent of the damage. They had to contain not just the fire, but also flooding, toxic fumes, and the threat of further explosions. Bulkheads had to be sealed, fire mains needed rerouting, electrical systems were compromised. In some compartments, sailors used wet rags to seal doorways. Others worked blindly in pitch-black corridors, crawling through smoke, laying down hoses, and shoring up critical structures weakened by the heat. Oxygen levels plummeted. Some men passed out from smoke inhalation before they could be rescued. Others never made it out. One of the greatest fears was that the fire would reach the magazines, rooms where bombs, missiles, and ammunition were stored in bulk. If the heat made it to those compartments, the entire ship could be lost. Emergency teams flooded magazines with seawater as a last resort, sacrificing millions in munitions to save the hull. Meanwhile, repair teams scrambled to keep the ship operational. Communications equipment was damaged, internal telephones were knocked out, and runners, messengers on foot, became the only reliable way to relay orders. Coordination broke down more than once, but the crew adapted. Heroism wasn't just on the flight deck. Below the surface, men made impossible decisions, sealing off compartments to contain fire or smoke, even when they knew shipmates were still inside. Some of the worst casualties came not from explosions, but from smoke and heat trapped in the ship's lower level. By late afternoon, fires below deck were mostly under control, but the cost had been enormous. Dozens were dead, many more injured, and the ship's core functions, power, propulsion, and flight operations, were deeply compromised. Still, the Forrestal did not sink. She did not lose all power, and thanks to the tireless efforts of her crew, she would limp back to port under her own power. The worst was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. While the flight deck bore the brunt of the explosions, the real test of the crew's endurance took place deep within the hull. Below the waterline, where there were no windows and little ventilation, the fire was a silent predator. Smoke seeped into the compartments miles from the initial blast. Toxic fumes from burning jet fuel and aircraft components invaded berthing spaces, machine rooms, and ammunition stores. In these tight, unlit spaces, faced a deadly choice: flee and survive, or stay and fight. Many chose the latter. Engineering crews stayed at their station, managing critical systems even as the ship trembled from the continuous detonations above. In the boiler rooms, temperatures soared as auxiliary systems failed. Some sailors collapsed from heat exhaustion or smoke inhalation. Others kept working until their last breath. Ammunition and fuel lines snaked through the ship like arteries. If the fire reached certain junctions, the Forrestal could have broken apart. Knowing this, sailors carried out emergency venting and flooding procedures. Seawater was pumped into compartments that would otherwise have been considered vital. The order to save the ship superseded everything, including lives. As hours passed, small teams of sailors combed the darkened corridors, searching for trapped crewmates. Many encountered bodies, some burned beyond recognition. Others found survivors barely clinging to consciousness, dragged them through the thick black smoke, and revived them topside with the little oxygen available. In medical spaces, the scene was overwhelming. Corpsmen and doctors operated with limited supplies and little sleep. Burns, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation. Their patients were in critical condition, often arriving faster than they could be treated. The ship's infirmary quickly filled, forcing makeshift triage stations in corridors and mess areas. Despite the mounting casualties, the spirit of the crew did not collapse. Senior officers rotated firefighting teams to give moments of rest. Volunteers flooded in to help wherever they could. There were no specialists anymore, only men trying to save their ship. When the last fires were extinguished after nearly 18 hours, the toll was staggering: 134 dead, 161 injured, and over 20 aircraft destroyed. But the Forrestal had survived. More importantly, her crew had proven that even the worst peacetime disaster in Navy history could not break their will. The Navy would never be the same, and neither would the men who served aboard her that day. The fire aboard USS Forrestal raged for nearly 18 hours. It was not a single blaze, but a series of erupting infernos that spread across multiple decks, fueled by jet fuel, live ordnance, and chaos. It was a living nightmare, and for those aboard, time lost all meaning. There were only two markers: before the first blast and everything after. The initial explosions had decimated the trained fire response teams. The surviving crew, many of whom had never trained for such a scenario, stepped into the void with little more than instinct and sheer grit. They rotated through shifts of fire suppression, rescue, and triage, each man doing what he could, often barefoot, helmetless, and gasping for air. By midday, efforts had shifted from containing the fire to simply keeping the ship afloat. Multiple bombs had detonated on the flight deck, and the heat began to warp the steel structure. Below, compartments were being intentionally flooded to counterbalance damage and keep ammunition stores from igniting. The waterline shifted, the ship listed, but she held. Smoke blanketed the ship, reducing visibility to just a few feet in some places. Even topside, the flight deck looked like a moonscape, scorched, cratered, and strewn with twisted metal and half-melted aircraft. Medics worked around the clock, converting galleys, lounges, and even showers into temporary wards. Helicopters ferried the worst cases to nearby carriers. As day turned to night, the fire lost its grip, but the psychological toll deepened. Sailors had seen their friends burned alive, blown apart, suffocated. The exhausted crew now faced the surreal aftermath, retrieving bodies, accounting for the missing, and restoring some measure of order to their floating home. At dawn the next morning, the last of the smoldering wreckage was extinguished. The silence that followed was haunting. The Forrestal looked like a wounded giant, still standing, but scarred. Official damage reports would later count 134 dead and 161 injured, with 21 aircraft lost and millions in damage. But numbers could not capture what had truly happened. The fire had exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most advanced ship in the fleet. More importantly, it revealed the unbreakable resolve of ordinary sailors thrust into an extraordinary crisis. 18 hours of hell, and they never gave up. As the smoke cleared and investigations began, attention turned to a name that had surfaced early in the chaos: Lieutenant Commander John S. McCain III. The son of a four-star admiral, McCain had been piloting the A-4 Skyhawk struck by the rogue Zuni rocket, the event that set the firestorm in motion. Rumors spread quickly. Some sailors, shaken by trauma and desperate for answers, whispered about a wet start, an intentional fuel-rich engine start meant to cause a dramatic backfire. Stories circulated that McCain had a habit of pulling such stunts to show off, and that this one might have gone horribly wrong. Some even suggested the fire had started on his aircraft. But the facts did not support the rumors. The Navy's official investigation, backed by deck camera footage and eyewitness testimony, confirmed that the fire began with the accidental discharge of a Zuni rocket from an F-4 Phantom parked across the deck. The rocket struck McCain's aircraft. He was not responsible for firing it, nor was his aircraft running at the time. The wet start theory, while sensational, was technically implausible in this context. A-4 Skyhawks did not produce the kind of dramatic afterburner plume attributed to wet starts on other jet types. Moreover, maintenance records and interviews confirmed no evidence of intentional misconduct. The real culprits were systemic: outdated bombs prone to cook-off, congested flight deck configurations, and inconsistent weapons handling procedures. The Zuni rocket had a known history of accidental discharge. On July 29th, all of those vulnerabilities converged. McCain himself nearly died in the initial blast. He escaped his burning jet and attempted to aid other pilots before being ordered below for safety. His prominence due to his family background made him an easy target for blame, but the investigation cleared him of wrongdoing. Still, the rumors lingered for decades. They would follow McCain throughout his political career, often resurfacing in internet forums and conspiracy circles. But among those who were there, the truth was more sobering. This was not a story of one man's recklessness, but of a Navy unprepared for its own worst-case scenario. The fire didn't begin with John McCain. It began with a spark in a faulty weapons system and a chain of failures no single pilot could have prevented. The inferno aboard the Forrestal was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. In the days and weeks that followed, the U.S. Navy launched a sweeping investigation, determined not only to understand what went wrong, but to ensure it would never happen again. The findings were stark, and the changes that followed would shape naval policy for generations. First and foremost was the realization that damage control training across the fleet was woefully inadequate. Many of the sailors who fought the fire on July 29 had done so without proper protective equipment, with little more than on-the-job improvisation. The Navy responded by creating an intensive and standardized damage control training program, including the establishment of the Navy's flagship school at Naval Station Norfolk. This facility, later named the Forrestal Fighting School, would become a cornerstone of naval readiness. Ordnance handling procedures were also overhauled. The investigation revealed that aging World War II-era bombs had been loaded onto modern jet aircraft simply because of supply shortages. The instability of these bombs under extreme heat was a known issue, but one that had been ignored. New policies mandated stricter controls on ordnance age, storage, and compatibility with modern airframes. Electrical and weapon systems on aircraft were modified to reduce the risk of unintentional discharges like the Zuni rocket incident. Ground safety interlocks were improved. Training scenarios were expanded to include mass casualty and deck fire simulations. And perhaps most significantly, the culture aboard aircraft carriers shifted, no longer treating damage control as a backwater duty, but as a fundamental skill set for all. The legacy of the Forrestal fire lived on in other ways too. The incident was studied in war colleges and training academies. Its footage, horrific but invaluable, became mandatory viewing for new carrier crews. The names of those who died became synonymous with valor and sacrifice, and their actions influenced the very protocols designed to save future lives. In the years that followed, the Navy faced other crises, but thanks to the painful lessons learned aboard the Forrestal, it was better prepared. Ships no longer assumed invulnerability. Sailors drilled with urgency. The shadow of July 29, 1967 loomed large, but it also lit the path forward. The Forrestal never returned to combat. She was repaired, recommissioned, and served in a variety of roles until her decommissioning in 1993. In 2015, she was towed to Brownsville, Texas, and scrapped. Her steel hauled away in pieces. But her legacy is still afloat in the systems, doctrines, and sailors she helped reshape. From fire came change, and from tragedy, a legacy of resilience. Before 1967, damage control was often treated as a secondary skill aboard U.S. Navy ships. Crews trained in basic firefighting, but the complexity of large-scale disasters, especially aboard aircraft carriers, was rarely simulated. The Forrestal fire changed that overnight. Within months, the Navy established a new standard of damage control readiness. Central to this was the creation of the Naval Firefighting School at Naval Station Norfolk. Its unofficial name, the Forrestal School. This wasn't just a classroom, it was a living laboratory. Instructors recreated carrier compartments, simulated electrical fires, introduced oil-fueled blazes, and drilled students in low-visibility, high-stress environments. Sailors learned to fight fires blindfolded, plug leaks under pressure, and coordinate mass casualty responses. They were trained to think like damage controlmen, regardless of their actual rating. Every new ship now incorporated upgraded firefighting systems, improved suppression equipment, and better compartmentalization. Fire-resistant materials replaced older flammables. Escape route signage was standardized and improved. Firefighting became not just a duty, but a culture. Today, every sailor attending firefighting school watches footage from the Forrestal. They learn the names of Chief Farrier and his team. They study the timeline of the disaster minute by minute. The message is clear. This must never happen again. The men of the Forrestal did not die in vain. Their sacrifice laid the foundation for the Navy's modern emergency response doctrine, and every sailor who dons firefighting gear carries their legacy forward. For those who served aboard the Forrestal, the fire never truly ended. It became a permanent chapter in their lives, etched into memories, retold in reunions, and carried in scars both seen and unseen. The disaster reshaped not just the Navy, but the lives of the men who survived it. Some left the service soon after, unable to reconcile the horrors they had witnessed. Others stayed, rising through the ranks, forever changed by what they had endured. For many, the events of July 29, 1967 became the defining moment of their naval careers. John McCain, whose aircraft had been struck in the initial rocket blast, would go on to endure another trial just months later, being shot down over North Vietnam and held for over 5 years as a prisoner of war. The fire aboard the Forrestal was his first brush with death, and one that reportedly haunted him throughout his life. He would often refer to it not as an incident, but as a crucible. Commemorations for the fallen were held annually by crew members and the families of those who died. The names of the 134 men lost were inscribed into plaques and memorials, but their greatest tribute lives in the transformations their death inspired. The ship herself, once the pride of the fleet, was eventually reduced to scrap. But in naval tradition, a ship is more than steel. It is the sum of the crew and the story they write upon the sea. The Forrestal story is one of innovation and miscalculation, of disaster and heroism, of institutional failure and individual triumph. Long after her hull was broken down in a Texas scrapyard, her memory continues in every damage control drill, every ordnance inspection, every carrier fire team's readiness check. The Forrestal fire is no longer just an event. It's a lesson, a legacy, and a warning carved into the bedrock of modern naval doctrine. For those who were there and those who learned from it, the Forrestal will never be just a name. It will always be a moment when everything changed and when ordinary men did the extraordinary to bring their ship home. I'm Dave Newton. I appreciate you watching. Please consider subscribing, and until next time, stand tall.